Hello, my name is Dejan Boshkov, Grandmaster from Bulgaria. Today we continue to study the typical endgames that arise in the Berlin defense, and for today I have chosen the bishops of the same color. This is also one of the difficult situations for the second player, as usually he still is a pawn down on the king's flank, and many things depend on the situation of his pawns on the queen's flank. If they are on black squares, usually the position is lost. This is the general hint that I'm going to give you. So if we see the pawns like that blocked, usually this is very difficult because white is not going only to create a pass pawn on the king's flank, but he will also have a second target on the queen's flank to attack it. And usually what he does is that he transfers a bishop on h4, speculating with the idea that those bishops cannot really be exchanged, as the pawn endgame says winner always lost for black, and after that he just activates the pieces to the maximum and eventually wins the game. So this is the game, very important game from the World Championship in Turkey. Ho Yifan is white against Konero. Hampi, this is the semi-final for the World Championship. The number 2 and number 1, the top-seeded players were facing each other, and with this victory, Ho managed to go to the finals. So what will be White's plan? One thing that she can do is to start advancing the pawns on the king's flank with h3, g4, king e4, and after that f5. But okay, this will give some chances for the second player. She is going to exchange both the h and the g pawns, and after that, as it was written in one of the Berlin books, I think Cox is the author of the book, and he wrote it very well. Black has reasonable chances to defend this by placing the king on d7 and waiting passively after that, hoping for a blockade. This is not going to happen in that endgame, as Ho Yifan probably also knew those things, and she decided to omit the push of the h-pawn and to perform this plan in a different way. So first of all, she's coming with the king to h3. A king e4, b6, black is... she just has to wait. She has nothing to do, and that's also one thing that is very unpleasant for the second player. We as human beings are not taught to wait patiently. I know very few people who like doing that, and this is normally a very difficult psychological situation for the second player as well. Bishop e7, king g3, keeping the h3 square available for the king. We're about to see why is it so important in a second. c6, king h3. That was the point. So the idea for white is just to transfer the bishop on h4, and the bishop will be activated to the maximum. Actually, that's why black played c6, so that she can eventually hide the bishop on c7 and try to protect the pawns on the queen's flank. If she didn't do that, if she didn't push that pawn, if she just stays, let's say, patiently like that, then after bishop coming to h4, that bishop is simply threatening to come on d8 and to harvest all the pawns on the black squares. So that's really terrible for black. Let's say bishop g5. After that, those pawns are exchanged on h5, or first even exchange on h5, bishop g5, and king is coming to take the pawn. And the defense for the second player is stretching. She cannot really defend both the h-pawn on the king's flank and these squares on the queen's flank, the d8 square and the pawns. That's why in the game, like we said, she played c6, king h3, sorry, king g3, c6, king h3, and now bishop d8. So bishop f2. Again, I'm going to repeat that even though you know it. The pawn endgame is usually lost for black. This is no exception. If she goes into a pawn endgame, let's say, somehow just waits and then takes. The plan for white is very simple. She advances the pawn to h5, or king first to g5, then pawn to h5, exchanges the pawns, h for g. Even with the best defense, black cannot handle it, because at some moment white just plays f5, temporary sacrifices a pawn, comes king f4, black will be in Zugzwang, she's going to lose that f pawn, and the e pawn is moving forward white is just sacrificing it some moment and takes the pawns on the queen's flank. So this is not working. Black is doomed to a passive defense. Bishop c7, bishop h4. The threat is bishop g5, king h4. That's why the bishop had to come in front to secure a safe road to the king, and now black is forced to take that pawn on g4. She wouldn't like to do that. She was hoping for blockade. She was hoping that white is going to take herself on h5, let's say in this position, something like that. But then black is just happy. She just has a strong blockade with the king, and this will be a draw. But white is not buying this. She just waits, and that's why she plays first bishop to h4 herself with that threat, forcing black to take on g4. And by doing that, the king is becoming too active. So king g7, now bishop is coming to f6, again giving a free ride for the king to the g5 square. Now black plays king f7. Let's just know that king h6 will soon bring to a Zugzwang as after, let's say, a move like h3. Black doesn't really have this move as those pawns are hanging. And this is something that I was talking about. The problem with the queen's flank pawns on the black squares is that some moment they are becoming target, and moreover, black is going into a Zugzwang now. She has to let the opponent's pieces pass, and white is just winning. She's just winning the pawns, the pawn on g6 and so on. So if this is not working, then the king has to let the opponent to be activated further on. King came to g5, b5 was played. This doesn't really change the situation because there is still a weak pawn on a5 which white can always attack in case that the bishop retreats from c7. So b5, king h6, b takes a4, b takes a4, bishop b6, and here the plan that Ho Yufan implemented in the game, bishop e7, was correct, but she could have also prepared that. Actually, bishop e7 immediately should have led to a draw by chance. It's a very lucky way for black to draw it. But white could have first improved the position of the pawn, improved the position of the pieces to the maximum and the pawns, and only after that sacrifice that bishop. So h4 was correct, bishop c7, and now bishop to e7, sacrificing the bishop, but in return activating the king and creating a powerful pass pawn, which black cannot really handle. For example, if king takes e7, then king takes g6, king f8, h5, bishop d8, keeping control over this square, but the white king is going to come for the e6 pawn in another way. So king g8, check. This pawn is a bait. White can simply give it away, but now she will have two pass pawns and also access to the other pawns of the opponent. So this is very easily won. King g7, king d7, bishop h4, f5, king f7, just takes that pawn, and after that takes everything basically. Bishop g3, check, king f6, king takes. There is no time for king takes f5 because of e7, e8 queen, and if she cannot do that, then white simply, actually after this check the king has to go to e7, otherwise there will be king d7 and e6, e7, e8 queen. So king e7 now takes king f6, king back to c6 with the idea king d6, and after that either e7 or c5, c6, c7, c8 queen, and three pawns are easily dealing with the opponent's a bishop and a king. So that was the winning plan, to sacrifice the bishop, but in return to get too many pass pawns. If black doesn't really take that bishop, if she tries to defend passively, what can she do? She can play something like bishop to b6, then bishop d6 is coming, and black is again in a Zugzwang. The king is not moving as she is losing the g6 pawn. If bishop a7, then our bishop on c7 is completely dominating, and black is also losing the a5 pawn. Finally, the counterattack bishop b6 will lose in another way. So for some exchanges, king e8, bishop takes c5. Okay, why not to defend passively? In case of bishop b6, there will be another Zugzwang coming. King is coming to a6, and again the bishop is not moving because the pawns are lost. And once that the king is coming to d7, then white is simply going to push f5 and e6 pawn. E pawn is going to be promoted to e8. And this is what white did in that endgame. Let's just repeat it one more time. It's very important, the way that white is winning in those positions. Just bring the king to h3, push g4, and transfer the bishop to h4, trying to attack the second weaknesses on the queen's flank, and in the meanwhile also trying to penetrate on the king's flank with the king. The second sample that we have is quite similar to the previous one. This is the game Yakovenko as white against Alexeyev that they played at the Russian Super Final 2008. Now the difference is that there are no h-pawns, and this makes the defense for black even harder. White just wants to bring the king closer and then to perform this maneuver like before. That's why black tried to stop it. He played g5, and he was hoping to exchange those pawns and eventually to blockade the position, but the thing is it's not really working. That blockade is not going to happen. So white just bravely exchanged those pawns, came with the king close, activated it to h3, and then performed the same maneuver that we have already seen, forcing black to exchange the bishops, as otherwise he is going to lose all the pawns on the queen's flank, and basically forcing him. So the only way for black to fight is to come somehow to counterattack the pawn on e5 and eventually to defend the pawns on the queen's flank. But nevertheless, white just plays bishop h4, and bishop g7 was met by a very strong move. We know that the pawn endgames are won for the first player, and this one isn't an exception. So bishop f6. The thing is that endgame after king takes f6, white already has a distant pass pawn, and after this very subtle move a4, gaining some space on the queen's flank, that will be important. You will see in a minute why white is completely winning. So next comes king g6. Okay, first white is transferring the king closer to the center, and after that the exchanges start. White's king is closer to those pawns, and this decides the outcome of the game. King f3, king d5, king e3, king c6, king d2, king takes c7, king c3. Now we see if the pawn was still on a2, black would have had that extra chance of advancing the pawn on a4, and now they don't have it. So he just takes the pawn. Now black tried a witty trick, king b4, but after king c6 he was forced for it to take the b3 pawn, and king b5 decides. It doesn't matter in which direction the black king goes, white will take precisely that pawn and defend his one in return, so he's easily winning. So we have seen that with the pawns on the black squares on the queen's flank, black is generally doomed, for he's almost always losing. Here we have a different case. The pawns are on light squares, and this is a specialty of the Chinese grandmaster Wang Yue, who played it as black many times, similar positions, and who managed to hold those positions in many times, although there are some details that we are about to see and which are important. This particular game is against Michael Adams, and it was played in Kalite 2008 at the European Club Cup. So he cleverly had put his pawn on b5 rather than on b6 and c5, and now he's going to show how this position is held. Adams played c4. Let me just clarify that bishop h4, the same plan that we have seen before, is not really working anymore. I mean, there are no objects to attack on the queen's flank. The king is just staying on d7. He's not going to allow the white bishop to get in. And also, black is not going to allow the white king to penetrate on g5. Let's say in case of bishop f6, Black is always playing bishop h6 himself, hitting the g5 square and attacking the pawn on f4, keeping the white's king busy. Or he can do it also if the king comes to h4. It's just enough to place the bishop on h6, not to let the king come on g5, and that will be good enough to defend, to make a draw. As this is no longer the winning pawn endgame, there are no squares from where white can break in. Or in case of g5, again, there are no breaking points in black's position, so he had ideally set his pawns on white squares and the bishop is protecting the black squares. And there are no objects for attack. And this is very key moment, a key defensive moment for the second player. So in the game, Adams tried c4, and basically he was not doing much in the next moves. Sooner or later he will have to push f5 if he wants to win that endgame. So black is just hitting the pawn, but basically he is doing nothing. He waits. Bishop h4, bishop d2, again keeping the king busy, not letting him to come somehow to g5. Bishop f2, bishop b4, king d3, king d7. Not much happens now. Bishop a5, they're just basically waiting for each other. Okay, now there is something very typical. He wants to exchange the bishops, but black is not buying it. Again, he's not buying it. a3, bishop e1. Okay, he was threatening to take that bishop already with b4 and c5. So bishop e1, bishop c5, bishop g3, still keeping the white pieces busy. King e3, bishop h4. It's impossible to trap that bishop. Black is not really afraid, so he just waits. King to d7, king g2, king e8, king f3, king d7. They wait for each other. Bishop f2, and finally white plays f5. A must for black is to exchange the g pawns, otherwise there will be a very strong g pass pawn. So he has to take, and furthermore he has to take that pawn as well, as otherwise in many cases white just wants to play f6 and to come with his king to g6. If black is not in time to make a blockade with king on f7, this can be winning. That's why the simplest for black is just to take, and this is more or less a fortress. Takes, b takes c4, b takes c4, bishop d4, hitting the pawn and trying to force it to be moved on e6. After that, the king just steps on e8 and there are no breaking points in black's position. So this is what happened. King f6, bishop b2. Just keep this diagonal and do not allow the pawn to be moved to e6. If this happens with the king on f7, it will be decisive. It will be deadly for black. Bishop c5, bishop c3, king f5, bishop b2 just waits. They just wait. Bishop to e3, bishop b2, a4, bishop c3, bishop f4, king e8. So, and furthermore, in a couple of moves, they agreed to draw. Like I said, it doesn't really matter if the pawn is on e6. He can hardly make any progress. I mean, okay, in this position, maybe the bishop can just be here to come on d6. Or even that bishop can come on a5. In any case, white can do nothing. The only thing that he can hope for is to take the c7 pawn, but it's very easy to be defended either by bishop a5 or bishop b6 or even bishop d6. And as there are no breaking entry points on the king's flank, that king is defending everything, the position is completely drawn. This was proved by Wang Yue in many games. Against Adams is one of them. Against Almash, he showed very convincingly that this is a draw, and against many other players. But we are going to see that things are not that simple. The same Wang Yue is playing as black, this time against Yakovenko. And if we compare the position from the one from before against Adams, the only difference that makes an important impact of the position is the situation of the pawn on c2 rather than on c4. And in fact, this important nuance was prepared by Yakovenko in his second before the game, because at this moment he played the move c3. And that very little, very tiny move makes the whole difference. Now the position is won for white. surprisingly, but it's completely won. The difference is that he has a new nuance to break the defense. He's threatening bishop d4 to exchange the bishops, and after that the pawn endgame is won as usual. So c3 breaks the black's defense in that case. Okay, if black stays still, then we know bishop d4 is coming. Let's say in case of king e7, bishop d4 and or first b4 and then bishop d4, and this is just lost. So he just played c5, c4 now, bishop a5, king f6, c6. So he tried still to defend passively, but it's no longer working, as white's king is going to the queen's flank and he's going to take those pawns. With the pawn on c6, the things are different. So here comes bishop e1, king e6, bishop h4. He's going to win the e7 pawn, but white managed to also to go for the pawns on the queen's flank, and there will be a rich harvest there. Takes, and those two pawns are easy prey for the white's pieces. King d8, bishop d6, pawn endgames are always lost. This one is no an exception. Bishop h4, he took on c5 with the bishop. Then the king is coming for the a pawn. He took that pawn as well. King b7, king b5, bishop g3. Why is he playing? Because this pawn is the promotional square of that pawn is the a8 square, which is a light square, and the bishop is not really in use in that case. So white has to be very careful when he's advancing the c pawn, not to allow black to sacrifice his bishop for that pawn. King b5, bishop g3, a4, king a8, bishop e3 threatening c5 and c6, bishop to d6, bishop d2, and he realized that white is not going to allow him to sacrifice the bishop for the pawn, and resigned. The winning plan will be to place first the bishop on b4. This will force the black bishop to go away from the diagonal. Then white simply plays c5, c6. The other pawn easily comes to a6. The bishop will come to b6. Okay, let's just show it. It will be easier. Let's say king b7, bishop b4. He cannot exchange the bishops, so he has to wait. The pawn is coming to c6. Then the other pawn is coming to a6. Bishop c5 could have been played as well. The threat is a7, so black has to come to defend that pawn. Bishop is coming to b6. Next, the king is coming to d7. He just waits. There is nothing that he can do. The pawns are on light squares, so they cannot be attacked by the black pieces. And once that the king is coming to d7, again c7 will be a big mistake. It will be a draw. But first, white can prepare this by coming with the bishop to d6, and finally c7 and c8 queen is coming. That's why black was completely lost. So what can we say about the bishops of the same color? Still, these endgames are very awful for the Berlin players. And in general, the endgames with only one remaining piece, light piece, are usually very difficult for the second player. This one is not an exception. It's best that black tries to avoid them. And if he goes for such endgames, at least to have the pawns on the queen's flank placed on light squares, either on b7, c6 and a6, or best on b5, a6 and c6, trying to create a successful blockade.